Marcus Johnson was not your average man. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from having seen too much and lived through even more. A decorated Army veteran, Marcus had spent years serving his country in 2 overseas tours. His bravery on the field earned him medals, but it also left him with invisible scars, memories of battles fought and friends lost. When he finally returned home to his small southern town, Marcus hoped for peace, but life, as it often does, had other plans. The town where Marcus grew up hadn't changed much since he left. It was still the same sleepy place, where everyone knew everyone else's business. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, casting long shadows over cracked sidewalks. People here liked things predictable. They liked knowing who belonged and who didn't. And while Marcus technically belonged, he'd been born and raised there, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about him made people uneasy now. Maybe it was the way he walked. Head held high, shoulders squared, like someone who refused to bow down to anyone or anything. Or maybe it was just the color of his skin, which seemed to matter more than ever. After leaving the military, Marcus decided to pursue a career in law. He wanted to fight injustice, not with weapons this time, but with words and knowledge. It wasn't an easy path. Many nights he sat alone at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of textbooks, trying to make sense of complicated legal jargon. During the day, he worked part-time at a local diner to pay the bills. The tips weren't great, but the work kept him grounded. Plus, it gave him a chance to observe people, their quirks, their biases, the way they treated each other when they thought no one was watching. One Friday evening, Marcus clocked out of the diner later than usual. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As he locked up, he noticed a group of men gathered near the corner store across the street. They were loud, laughing, and clearly drunk. Marcus didn't think much of it until one of them spotted him and shouted something unintelligible. At first, Marcus ignored it, keeping his focus on the road ahead. But then came another shout, louder this time, cutting through the quiet night air. "Hey, you! Yeah, you, boy!" Marcus stopped walking. He turned slowly, meeting the man's gaze. The speaker was unsteady on his feet, clutching a beer bottle in one hand. His face was flushed, and his eyes gleamed with malice. "What did you call me?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. "You heard me," the man slurred, taking a step forward. "Don't act like you're better than us. You ain't nothing but a—" Before he could finish, Marcus interrupted. "I'm just trying to get home," he said firmly. "There's no need for trouble." But trouble found him anyway. The man lunged, swinging wildly, but Marcus sidestepped easily, avoiding the blow. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, hoping to defuse the situation. Unfortunately, the commotion drew the attention of passing police officers. Blue lights flashed as a squad car screeched to a halt nearby. 2 officers jumped out, guns drawn, shouting commands. "Get on the ground, now!" one of them barked. Confused and frustrated, Marcus complied. He lay flat on the cold pavement, hands behind his head as the officers cuffed him. Meanwhile, the drunk man staggered back to his friends, muttering under his breath. No one bothered to ask what had really happened. To them, the sight of a black man being detained was all too familiar. At the courthouse holding cell, Marcus waited silently, replaying the events in his mind. How had things escalated so quickly? Why hadn't anyone listened to him? These questions gnawed at him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. Still, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. Something told him this wasn't going to end well. That's when Carl Hargrove entered the picture. Carl was a bailiff, a burly, middle-aged man, with a reputation for being tough. Some might have called him efficient, others would have described him as cruel. Over the years, Carl had developed a knack for intimidating defendants, especially those he deemed troublemakers. To him, Marcus fit the bill perfectly. As Carl approached the holding cell, he sized Marcus up with a sneer. "So, you're the one causing all the fuss tonight?" he growled. Without waiting for a response, Carl began patting Marcus down, searching for contraband. When his fingers brushed against the dog tags hanging around Marcus's neck, Carl paused. "What's this?" he demanded, yanking the chain roughly. "My dog tags," Marcus replied evenly. "From my time in the army." Carl snorted. "Yeah, right. Like you were really in the military." He held the tags up to the light, inspecting them skeptically. "These look fake to me." "They're not," Marcus insisted. "I served 2 tours. I have papers to prove it." But Carl wasn't interested in proof. Instead, he smirked, leaning closer. "You know what? I think we need to teach you some respect." With that, he grabbed a pair of scissors from his belt and grabbed a handful of Marcus's hair. Before Marcus could protest, Carl started cutting, shaving his head almost bald. Humiliated and furious, Marcus clenched his fists but remained silent. He knew better than to resist. This wasn't the first time someone in power had tried to break him, and it probably wouldn't be the last. What Carl didn't realize, however, was that his actions wouldn't go unnoticed. Unbeknownst to everyone in the room, Judge Evelyn Carter, a formidable figure known for her fairness and sharp wit, was watching the entire scene unfold via security cameras, and she wasn't about to let Carl get away with it. Little did Marcus know this moment would set off a chain reaction that would change both their lives forever. The fluorescent lights in the courthouse buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow over the cold, sterile walls. Marcus sat on the hard bench inside the holding cell, his hands still cuffed behind his back. His shaved head felt exposed, vulnerable, and every time he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the metal door of the cell, anger bubbled up inside him. But Marcus wasn't one to let his emotions take control. He had learned long ago, during his years in the military, that losing your cool only made things worse. So he sat there staring at the floor, trying to steady his breathing and keep his thoughts focused. Carl Hargrove, meanwhile, stood just outside the cell, arms crossed over his chest, looking smug. To him, this was just another day on the job, another troublemaker put in their place. Carl had always prided himself on being tough, on never backing down from anyone, especially those he deemed disrespectful or dangerous. Over the years, he'd developed a reputation for being abrasive, even cruel, but no one ever challenged him. The other officers knew better than to cross him. Some agreed with his methods. Others simply didn't want to deal with the fallout, if they spoke up. Either way, Carl operated with near total impunity, convinced that his authority gave him license to do whatever he pleased. As Marcus sat silently, replaying the humiliation in his mind, Carl leaned against the wall, casually, chatting with one of the deputies. "You see how these guys are," Carl said, jerking his thumb toward the holding cell. "Always acting like they're innocent, like we're the bad guys. It's pathetic." The deputy nodded along half-heartedly, avoiding eye contact. Everyone knew Carl liked to hear himself talk, and arguing with him was rarely worth the effort. But what Carl didn't realize was that someone was watching him. Judge Evelyn Carter, who presided over the courtroom where Marcus's case would soon be heard, had stepped out briefly to review some documents in her chambers. Before leaving, she had glanced at the security monitors mounted on the wall, a habit she'd picked up after years of dealing with unruly defendants and overzealous bailiffs. What she saw stopped her cold. On the grainy black and white screen, Evelyn watched as Carl grabbed Marcus by the hair and began cutting it off. She froze, her pen hovering midair above the paperwork in front of her. Her lips pressed into a thin line and her eyes narrowed as she leaned closer to the monitor. Even through the staticky image, the cruelty of Carl's actions was unmistakable. Evelyn felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach, the same one she got whenever she witnessed injustice, whether big or small. Evelyn Carter wasn't new to discrimination. Growing up in the South during the 1960s, she had faced her share of prejudice. As a young black woman determined to become a lawyer, she had been told countless times that she didn't belong, that law was no place for someone like her. But Evelyn had refused to listen. She worked twice as hard as everyone else, earning scholarships and degrees until she finally landed a seat on the bench. Now, decades later, she was known as one of the toughest judges in the county. Defendants dreaded appearing before her because she brooked no nonsense, But she was also fair, an attribute that earned her respect among colleagues and community members alike. Still, Evelyn carried scars from her past, invisible ones that flared up whenever she encountered racism or abuse of power. Watching Carl humiliate Marcus brought back memories she thought she'd buried long ago. Memories of teachers dismissing her questions, employers passing her over for promotions, and strangers crossing the street to avoid walking near her. These experiences had shaped her into the person she was today, fiercely intelligent, unapologetically direct, and deeply committed to justice. When Evelyn returned to the courtroom, she did so with purpose. Her heels clicked sharply against the tiled floor, announcing her presence before she even entered the room. The bailiffs and deputies straightened instinctively as she passed, sensing the shift in energy. Evelyn ignored them, heading straight for her chambers without a word. Once, inside, she closed the door and exhaled slowly, allowing herself a moment to process what she had seen. Then, with deliberate movements, she picked up the phone and called the courthouse security office. "I need footage from holding cell B," she said curtly. "Right now." Within minutes, a technician arrived with a flash drive containing the video feed. Evelyn inserted it into her computer and watched the scene again, this time in silence. Every snip of the scissors, every sneer on Carl's face, it all played out in stark detail. When the clip ended, Evelyn sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. She had seen enough. Back in the courtroom, proceedings were underway. Defendants shuffled in and out, their cases resolved quickly under Evelyn's efficient gavel. But when Marcus's name was called, Evelyn paused. She instructed the clerk to hold the case momentarily and requested a private meeting with Carl Hargrove. The request sent ripples of unease through the room. No one could remember the last time Judge Carter had singled out a bailiff for anything, let alone a private conversation. Carl, oblivious to the storm brewing, sauntered into Evelyn's chambers with his usual swagger. "You wanted to see me, Your Honor?" he asked, tipping an imaginary hat. His tone was casual, almost mocking, as though he expected this to be nothing more than a routine check-in. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her computer monitor toward him, playing the footage of his actions in the holding cell. Carl's smirk faltered as he watched himself shave Marcus's head. For a moment, he looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't understand why this was such a big deal. Then slowly, realization dawned on his face. His shoulders tensed, and he opened his mouth to speak, but Evelyn cut him off. "Do you care to explain yourself, Mr. Hargrove?" she asked, her voice icy. There was no trace of warmth or leniency in her gaze, only steel. Carl stammered, fumbling for words. "Your Honor, I was just following protocol. That man was causing trouble. There is no protocol that allows you to humiliate a defendant in my courthouse," Evelyn interrupted sharply. "And don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." Carl's face reddened, but he pressed on. "He disrespected me, Your Honor. I was teaching him a lesson." "A lesson?" Evelyn repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you call it? Because what I see here is abuse of power, and I won't tolerate it, not in my courtroom, not under my watch." For the first time in years, Carl found himself at a loss for words. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the door as if considering making a run for it. But Evelyn wasn't done yet. "You have two options," she continued, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You can resign immediately, effective today, or I will file criminal charges against you for assault and misconduct. Choose wisely." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Carl stared at her, his jaw working, soundlessly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he muttered something unintelligible and stormed out of the chamber, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the hallway, drawing curious glances from the staff. Whispers began to spread, but no one dared approach Evelyn for clarification. They knew better than to question her decisions. Back in the courtroom, Marcus waited anxiously, unaware of the drama unfolding behind closed doors. When Judge Carter finally called his case, her demeanor was calm and composed, as though nothing unusual had happened. She addressed Marcus directly, her voice firm but kind. "Mr. Johnson," she began, "I want to assure you that what happened earlier today does not reflect the values of this court. Justice must be served fairly and impartially, and I intend to ensure that happens." Marcus blinked, taken aback by her words. For the first time since his arrest, he felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice tinged with gratitude. Evelyn nodded, then proceeded to dismiss the charges against him, citing lack of evidence and clear bias in his detention. As Marcus stood to leave, he caught a glimpse of Carl Hargrove hurrying out of the building, his face pale and drawn. It was a small victory, but for Marcus it meant everything. Little did either of them know this was only the beginning. The events of that day would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the courthouse walls. For Marcus, it was a turning point, a reminder that standing up for justice, even in the face of overwhelming odds, could lead to change. And for Carl, it was a wake-up call, one that would force him to confront the ugly truths about himself and the world he thought he understood. The days following Marcus Johnson's release from the courthouse were a whirlwind. News of what had happened spread like wildfire, fueled by social media posts and local news outlets eager to cover the shocking story. A decorated veteran humiliated by a bailiff in a courthouse? It was the kind of headline that grabbed attention and sparked outrage. Within hours, Marcus became an unlikely symbol of resilience, a man who had endured injustice but refused to let it break him. At first, Marcus tried to stay out of the spotlight. He wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, especially not for something so painful. But as messages poured in, texts, emails, comments on social media, he realized he couldn't ignore the growing support. People from all walks of life reached out to share their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment at the hands of authority figures. Some praised Marcus for his composure during such a degrading ordeal. Others offered words of encouragement, urging him to keep fighting for justice. Community leaders took notice too. Local pastors invited Marcus to speak at church gatherings, while activists organized rallies outside the courthouse to demand accountability. One particularly passionate group even started a fundraiser to help Marcus pay off his student loans and cover living expenses while he completed his legal education. The response overwhelmed him, not just because of the financial support, but because of the sense of solidarity it created. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he wasn't alone. Meanwhile, Judge Evelyn Carter's actions didn't go unnoticed either. Her decision to confront Carl Hargrove and hold him accountable sent shockwaves through the courthouse staff. Some applauded her bravery, whispering that it was about time someone stood up to Carl's bullying behavior. Others, however, grumbled privately, accusing her of overstepping or making things personal. Evelyn ignored the murmurs, focusing instead on ensuring that the incident led to meaningful change. She called an emergency meeting with the courthouse administration, demanding a review of policies regarding how defendants were treated. "This isn't just about one bad apple," she told them firmly. "It's about creating a system where everyone is treated with dignity, regardless of their background." Her words carried weight, and within weeks, new training programs were implemented to address implicit bias and abuse of power among court personnel. While these measures weren't perfect, they marked an important step forward. For Carl Hargrove, life after the courthouse incident was anything but easy. Resigning had been a bitter pill to swallow, and the shame of being publicly exposed weighed heavily on him. At first, he tried to downplay the situation, telling anyone who asked that he'd simply had enough of working there. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had crossed a line, and now he was paying the price. Finding work proved difficult. No one wanted to hire a disgraced former bailiff, especially when videos of his misconduct continued to circulate online. Carl spent most of his days holed up in his small apartment, drinking cheap beer and staring blankly at the TV. He avoided going out, fearing judgmental stares or worse, confrontation. Loneliness crept in, gnawing at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, Carl began to reflect on his life, questioning the choices that had brought him here. One evening, Desperate for a change of scenery, Carl wandered into a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. The place smelled of stale cigarettes and spilled liquor, but it was quiet, save for the low hum of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. He slid onto a stool at the far end of the counter, ordering a whiskey neat. As he sipped his drink, he noticed an older man sitting a few seats away, nursing a glass of bourbon. There was something familiar about him, his posture, his salt and pepper hair, but Carl couldn't quite place it. After a while, the man turned to Carl and struck up a conversation. "Rough day?" he asked casually, his voice warm and inviting. Carl shrugged, mumbling something non-committal. The man chuckled softly. "Don't worry, I've been there. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it." Intrigued, despite himself, Carl glanced at the man. "You don't look like the type to have rough days," he said, gesturing vaguely at the man's tailored suit and polished shoes. The man laughed again, shaking his head. "Oh, trust me, I've had plenty. Used to be a judge, actually. Retired now, but those years on the bench taught me a thing or two about mistakes and redemption." The word redemption caught Carl's attention. He hesitated, then decided to take a chance. What if you made a mistake so big, people can't forgive you?" The man studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Well, forgiveness starts with owning up to what you've done. You can't fix something unless you admit it's broken, right?" Carl frowned, swirling the remaining liquid in his glass. "But what if no one believes you? What if you're stuck carrying that weight forever?" "Then you carry it," the man replied simply. "And you use it to do better. Maybe you won't get the apology you want, but you can still make amends. Teach others what you've learned. Pay it forward." The simplicity of the advice hit Carl like a punch to the gut. For so long he'd justified his actions, blaming others for his behavior. But sitting there, listening to this stranger, he realized how hollow those excuses sounded. He thought about Marcus, the way he'd kept his cool despite everything Carl had done to provoke him. That kind of strength came from somewhere deep inside, a place Carl wasn't sure he could reach anymore. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to try. As Carl mulled over the conversation, Marcus was busy building a new chapter of his life. Thanks to the community fundraiser, he was able to quit his job at the diner and focus full-time on his studies. He also secured a prestigious internship at a civil rights law firm, where he worked closely with attorneys tackling cases of police brutality, workplace discrimination, and voter suppression. Each day brought new challenges, but Marcus embraced them wholeheartedly, driven by a renewed sense of purpose. Still, he never forgot the humiliation he'd endured at the courthouse. Instead of letting it harden him, though, he used it as fuel. During public speaking engagements, he shared his story openly, emphasizing the importance of standing up against systemic racism. His speeches resonated deeply with audiences, earning him invitations to conferences and panel discussions across the country. Yet despite his growing fame, Marcus remained humble, always reminding himself why he'd chosen this path in the first place. One afternoon, as Marcus prepared for another internship assignment, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the courthouse administration, thanking him for his cooperation in the investigation into Carl Hargrove's conduct. They assured him that steps were being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. Reading the message, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Justice might not always be swift, but it was moving in the right direction. Little did Marcus know Carl Hargrove was beginning to move too, slowly, tentatively, but with a glimmer of hope. The conversation at the bar had planted a seed in his mind, challenging him to confront the prejudices he'd carried for so long. Whether he would succeed in changing remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, Carl felt a flicker of possibility. Perhaps redemption wasn't out of reach after all. And so, as the sun set over the small southern town, casting golden light over its streets and rooftops, two men, one seeking justice, the other seeking forgiveness, found themselves on parallel journeys toward healing. Their paths may never cross again, but the impact of their shared experience would linger, shaping not only their lives, but the lives of those around them. Months turned into years, and life in the small southern town continued its steady rhythm. The seasons changed, bringing with them new challenges and opportunities for growth. For Marcus Johnson, the passage of time brought significant milestones. His dedication to his legal education paid off when he graduated at the top of his class, earning not just a degree, but also the admiration of professors and peers alike. The internship at the civil rights law firm had blossomed into a full-time position, and Marcus quickly established himself as a formidable advocate for marginalized communities. His reputation grew beyond the courtroom. Marcus became a sought-after speaker, invited to universities, community centers, and even national conferences to share his story. He spoke passionately about systemic racism, police brutality, and the importance of reforming institutions that perpetuated inequality. Audiences listened intently, moved by his eloquence and conviction. Yet despite the accolades and recognition, Marcus remained grounded. He knew that real change happened not through speeches or awards, but through action, through fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. One day, while preparing for a particularly high-profile case involving wrongful imprisonment, Marcus received an unexpected letter. It was addressed simply, "To Marcus Johnson, from Carl Hargrove." First, Marcus hesitated to open it. The name alone stirred up memories he'd worked hard to compartmentalize: the humiliation, the anger, the sense of helplessness. But curiosity got the better of him, and he carefully unfolded the paper inside. The letter was brief, but sincere. Carl wrote that he had spent the past few years reflecting on his actions and the harm he had caused, not just to Marcus, but to countless others over the course of his career. He admitted that he had been wrong, deeply so, and expressed regret for the pain he had inflicted. "I don't expect forgiveness," Carl wrote, "but I wanted you to know that your strength that day made me see myself clearly for the first time. If I can make amends, even in some small way, I will." Marcus read the letter several times, his emotions shifting between disbelief, anger, and something resembling pity. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tucked the letter away in a drawer, unsure of what to do with it. Over the next few weeks, though, he found himself thinking about Carl more often than he cared to admit. Was this apology genuine? Could someone like Carl truly change? Or was this just another attempt to ease his conscience? Around the same time, Carl's journey toward redemption was unfolding in quiet, incremental ways. After his conversation with the retired judge at the bar, Carl began attending counseling sessions recommended by a friend. The therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Emily Torres, helped him unpack decades of ingrained biases and unresolved guilt. At first, Carl resisted, dismissing her insights as touchy-feely nonsense. But as the weeks went by, he started to open up, revealing parts of himself he hadn't acknowledged before. Dr. Torres encouraged Carl to volunteer at a local nonprofit organization that provided job training and mentorship to formerly incarcerated individuals. Reluctantly, Carl agreed. On his first day, he arrived at the center feeling out of place, convinced that no one would trust him. To his surprise, however, the staff welcomed him warmly, assigning him to assist with resume workshops. As he worked alongside former inmates, many of whom were Black or Latino, Carl began to see them not as stereotypes, but as people, individuals with dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. One participant, a young man named Derek, reminded Carl of Marcus. Derek had served time for a crime he claimed he didn't commit, and his frustration with the justice system mirrored the stories Carl had heard during his counseling sessions. Listening to Derek talk about his struggles reignited Carl's guilt, but it also gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe he couldn't undo the past, but he could help prevent others from suffering the same fate. Back in Marcus's world, his legal career reached new heights. His work on several landmark cases earned him national attention, and soon, whispers began circulating about potential judicial appointments. The idea seemed almost surreal to Marcus. Growing up, he had never imagined stepping into a role of such authority. especially not in a system he had once viewed with skepticism. But now he saw it as an opportunity to create lasting change from within. When the official nomination came, Marcus accepted with humility and determination. His swearing-in ceremony was a modest affair, attended by family, friends, and colleagues, who had supported him throughout his journey. As he stood before the audience taking the oath of office, Marcus felt a profound mix of pride and responsibility. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a testament to resilience, perseverance, and the power of collective effort. On his first day as a judge, Marcus entered the courtroom with measured steps, his robe flowing behind him. The room fell silent as everyone rose to their feet. Taking his seat at the bench, Marcus scanned the gallery, his eyes lingering briefly on the empty space where Carl Hargrove used to stand. He wondered if Carl would ever muster the courage to face him again, or if their paths would remain forever separate. As fate would have it, Carl did show up, not in the courtroom itself, but in the courthouse lobby later that afternoon. Dressed. In plain clothes, he lingered near the exit, clutching a worn hat in his hands. When Marcus emerged from the elevator, Carl stepped forward hesitantly, clearing his throat. "Judge Johnson," he said, his voice trembling. May I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus paused, studying Carl's weathered face. Gone was the arrogance and hostility that had defined him in the past. In its place was vulnerability, a raw, unguarded honesty that caught Marcus off guard. Against his instincts, he nodded and gestured for Carl to follow him into a nearby conference room. Once inside, Carl wasted no time. "I owe you an apology," he began, his words spilling out in a rush. "For what I did to you. All of it. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I let my prejudices control me, and I hurt a lot of people because of it, including you." Marcus listened silently, his expression unreadable. When Carl finished, there was a long pause. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Apologies are important, Mr. Hargrove. They're a start. But they mean nothing without action. Have you changed? Are you working to be better?" Carl nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. I've been volunteering at a program for ex-offenders. Trying to give back, you know? It's not much, but it's something." Marcus considered this, then extended his hand. "Change isn't easy," he said. "But if you're serious about making amends, keep going. Keep learning. Keep teaching others what you've learned." Carl shook Marcus's hand, tears welling in his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild his life. As he walked away, Marcus watched him go, a complicated mix of emotions swirling inside him. Forgiveness wasn't easy, and trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. But perhaps in time, healing was possible for both of them. Little did either man realize their journeys were far from over. Each step they took, whether apart or together, contributed to a larger narrative of accountability, redemption, and the enduring pursuit of justice. And in that shared struggle, they found not only themselves, but also a glimpse of the kinder, fairer world they both hoped to build. Years passed, and the small southern town where Marcus Johnson and Carl Hargrove's lives had intersected continued to evolve. Change came slowly but steadily, like the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. The courthouse that once symbolized injustice for Marcus now stood as a testament to progress, a place where reforms were implemented, policies rewritten, and voices once silenced began to be heard. Marcus, now Judge Marcus Johnson, presided over his courtroom with the same quiet strength he'd carried throughout his life. His rulings were fair, thoughtful, and rooted in empathy, earning him respect even from those who disagreed with him. But it wasn't just Marcus who was changing. The ripple effects of his journey and Carl's redemption spread far beyond their personal stories. The nonprofit organization where Carl volunteered grew into a thriving hub for reintegration programs, offering job training, counseling, and mentorship to formerly incarcerated individuals. Carl became one of its most dedicated volunteers, mentoring young men and women trying to rebuild their lives after prison. At first, many participants eyed him warily, unsure how to reconcile his past actions with his present efforts. But over time, they came to see him not as the man he used to be, but as someone genuinely committed to helping them succeed. One evening, during a community event hosted by the nonprofit, Carl stood at the podium to share his story. It was something he had never imagined doing. Public speaking terrified him, but he knew it was necessary. Facing an audience filled with former inmates, volunteers, and supporters, Carl took a deep breath and began. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves gnawing at him. "What I did in the past was wrong, and no amount of regret can undo the harm I caused. But I'm here because I believe in second chances, not just for others, but for myself too. This work has taught me humility, patience, and the importance of listening. If my story can help even one person avoid the mistakes I made, then maybe I've done some good." The room erupted in applause, and Carl stepped down, visibly shaken but proud. Among the crowd was Marcus, who had been invited to speak later in the program. As their eyes met briefly, Marcus gave Carl a subtle nod of acknowledgement. There were no words exchanged between them, but the gesture spoke volumes. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant moving forward together, each carrying the lessons of the past into a brighter future. Meanwhile, Marcus's influence extended beyond the courtroom. He became a mentor to young law students, particularly those from underrepresented communities, encouraging them to pursue careers in justice reform. One of his mentees, a brilliant young woman named Tanya Harris, reminded him of himself when he was starting out, determined, passionate, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. Under his guidance, Tanya excelled, eventually interning at the same civil rights law firm where Marcus had begun his career. Tanya often accompanied Marcus to community events, including the one where Carl spoke. Afterward, she approached Carl, curiosity lighting up her face. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, extending her hand, "I've heard about the work you're doing. It's inspiring." Carl hesitated before shaking her hand, still uncomfortable with praise. "Thank you," he replied gruffly, "but I'm just trying to do what's right. People like your boss," he gestured toward Marcus, "deserve better than what they got from people like me." Tanya smiled warmly. "We all have room to grow, don't we? That's what makes us human." Her words stayed with Carl long after the event ended. They echoed in his mind as he drove home, replaying alongside memories of the countless faces he had encountered through his volunteer work. Each person had a story, a struggle, a dream, and Carl realized that his role wasn't to fix their problems, but to support them in finding their own solutions. In doing so, he found a sense of purpose he hadn't known existed. As time went on, Marcus's courtroom became known not only for its fairness, but also for its humanity. He understood that behind every case was a human being, a person shaped by circumstances often beyond their control. Whether ruling on criminal cases or civil disputes, Marcus approached each decision with compassion, striving to balance accountability with understanding. One such case involved a young man named Jamal, accused of shoplifting groceries to feed his family. Jamal's attorney argued that he had acted out of desperation, pointing to systemic issues like poverty and lack of access to resources. The prosecution countered that theft was still a crime, regardless of motive. Listening intently, Marcus weighed both sides carefully before delivering his verdict. Guilty, but with leniency. Instead of jail time, Jamal was sentenced to community service and required to attend financial literacy classes provided by the nonprofit where Carl worked. After the hearing, Jamal approached Marcus outside the courtroom, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Your Honor," he choked out. "I promise I'll do better." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You already are," he said softly. "Don't let this define you. Use it to build a better future for yourself and your family." Watching the exchange from a distance, Carl felt a lump rise in his throat. He thought back to the countless times he had dismissed defendants like Jamal as criminals unworthy of sympathy. Now, seeing the impact of empathy and rehabilitation firsthand, he understood how misguided he had been. Every interaction, every decision mattered, not just for the individual involved, but for the broader community. Decades later, when Marcus retired from the bench, the town held a celebration in his honor. Friends, colleagues, and former clients gathered to thank him for his contributions to justice reform. Even Carl attended, standing quietly at the back of the room, clutching a framed photo of himself and Marcus taken at the nonprofit event years earlier. When Marcus spotted him, he motioned for Carl to join him on stage. Addressing the crowd, Marcus shared reflections on his journey, emphasizing the importance of resilience, accountability, and collective effort. "Justice isn't perfect," he said, his voice resonating through the hall. "It's messy, complicated, and sometimes painful. But it's worth fighting for. Not because it's easy, but because it's right." Then turning to Carl, Marcus added, "And sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms, like learning to forgive, or teaching others to do the same. We all have a role to play in creating a world where dignity and fairness aren't privileges, but rights for everyone." The audience erupted in applause, and Carl blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the moment. As he descended from the stage, he felt a profound sense of closure, not just for himself, but for the countless lives touched by the choices he and Marcus had made. In the end, their story wasn't just about two men navigating the complexities of forgiveness and redemption. It was about the power of humanity to heal, to grow, and to transform. And though neither Marcus nor Carl could claim perfection, they had proven that even in the face of adversity, hope and change were always possible, if only we dared to embrace them.